welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Martin Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm going to talk about car clubs, and I'm going to talk about the committee side of car clubs, give you a little bit of an idea as to what that sort of thing entails, what's kind of expected of a car club committee, and maybe a little bit of a chat about what the future might hold for some of the car clubs that still use the traditional committee structure. Now, I was going to record this on the way home from a committee meeting. Just the weekend gone, the MMOC had a committee meeting in Gaydon at the British Motor Museum, who have rooms there that you can book out to use for car club committees or events or things like that. And usually they'd be held at Derby or via Zoom or things like that, but usually there's one a year that's held kind of on location as to where National might be, or near location as to where National might be, in order to do a bit of a site visit to what the planned location of National is and incorporate that into the meeting so that we can get some planning done. And that was what happened. So I got there about 9:30, 9:45, got some photos of a basically empty Gaydon car park, and fortunately we had a very productive meeting and a lot of stuff got done, but it did mean that it went on quite a while. And after kind of giving myself a brief half an hour nosy around the museum and a poke at my head in the gift shop, I didn't really have the opportunity to film because it was dark enough on the way home then to really make it difficult to record this podcast. So I'm recording it today when I'm on my way home from work. That gives you an idea. This is something I'll get onto a little bit in terms of the commitment that can be involved in being involved in a car club committee and some of the stuff that you'll have to get up to, but I'll get onto that in a little bit. Let's start with kind of what a car club committee is supposed to be. And I found a really useful document for a lot of this podcast on Motorsport Australia's website. They had a document there that was kind of giving guidance to people who were setting up committees within Australian motorsport, and I think a lot of that was quite useful. Because I'm not doing this about any in particular committee. I've been involved with a couple of car club committees, either as kind of advisors or on the committee, and so I think there's a lot that can be said about lots of committees, and this is more of a general coverage of my personal experience. But this document noted how a car club committee is intended to be kind of a stable, knowledgeable, future-facing group of individuals who are working in the best interests of the club, who are looking to kind of keep things going in the moment, but also plan effectively for the future of the club. It should be well functioning and able to make decisions, think about planning and making good actions and thinking about future events. And it should be kind of a collaborative effort that has the rest of the club in its entirety represented in some way, shape or form. So the introduction of some clubs more recently to having a young members representative on the committee is a representation of that. Often car clubs have kept young members sections separate and as kind of their own individual committee, but if we want young members to stay part of committees and kind of progress up, it builds in succession to have them on the committee, but also shows them as being kind of represented within the big club decisions, not just kind of their own young members' decisions. They have to consider lots of things. So they have to think about policy making, market research, what's going on in the sector. They have to think about what the membership wants, what's best for events and planning and things like that. They have to think about staffing, volunteering, time management, any training that's required. There's lots of things for a club regardless of size, to kind of think about in a lot of regards. And so having a team of people that represent the breadth of the club can be really useful, because they can all have different perspective and experiences. But also what I've found is very rarely with car people are you a member of one club or have experience of one club. So being on a committee of one club but having experience of others can be really useful in kind of providing that perspective, and useful for the market research and stuff like that as well. The Motorsport Australia noted that there was kind of 4 key functions for all committees, and that was planning, organising, leading and controlling. And I think that's a good way of thinking about everything that a committee does, and thinking about kind of what's included on agendas and things within committee meetings, in terms of most things that are talked about fit into one of those 4 categories: either planning for the future, planning upcoming things, organising events, organising the overall structure of the club, organising the location of spares, who's selling the spares, the merchandise, organising that aspect, leading the way in terms of what is the future of these vehicles and how do we envisage that going is also incredibly important, and kind of controlling what is and isn't permitted within kind of the future of the car ownership. In terms of things that I think are important for somebody considering becoming a committee member, commitment is going to be a big thing, and having the time to be able to commit to it can be really tricky, and we'll get onto that in a little bit more detail soon. You're going to have a good understanding of how these sorts of things go, and that can be to an extent learned on the roll, but the ability to listen and engage and kind of speak clearly about your thoughts also plays an important role. A willingness to accept responsibility, to take on extra kind of miniature roles within what you might be appointed as a main role, and a willingness to kind of work with others and engage with that sort of thing going forward can be really important too. Having the ability to be tactful, make good judgments, key listening and team working, again, all really important skills. So actually getting involved with car committees and things like that can be weirdly a really useful thing to do for CVs and stuff, because being involved with this sort of thing involves a lot of, I guess, transferable skills. And traditionally, I guess, we've thought about car committees being run by retired people who already have these skills, who are trying to kind of keep putting them to work. But in reality, I think it can be equally useful for young people to get involved, not only to be represented by these committees, but to start working on these skills and be kind of nurtured by some of the older members with a bit more experience in that area. Dedication and good communication is also really key. Having the ability to communicate well and take on board criticism and work with it is going to help things run smoothly, and just generally engaging in conversation in a respectful manner. Sometimes when you're on a committee, you're going to have a specific area or task that's allocated to you to kind of look after. Other times you're going to be an individual who is just on the committee as a representation of the general broader club, and having an understanding of kind of the differences between that and what that might look like can be really useful, and an understanding that maybe if you have kind of a broader role within the committee, that might mean that you've got the ability to kind of flit in and try a few different things when it comes to bigger projects or subcommittees and things like that. But in general, most committees require at least a chairman, a treasurer and a secretary, especially if, as most car clubs nowadays are kind of run as businesses as well. And so those roles are generally required for things like becoming a limited company and having those 3 roles within the directors of that company. So it shares that kind of structure, but I think it really predates that. If you look at kind of old magazines from clubs before they were limited companies and stuff like that, you would find that those roles still existed even then. And in order for a committee meeting to be legitimate and for the members to be legitimate, they have to be somewhat approved in some way, shape or form by the membership. And this can take the form of somebody kind of taking on a role on the committee on a temporary basis until they're kind of agreed and voted in at the AGM, or it can be a case of just kind of announcing someone at an AGM and then seeing if anybody's got any issues and stuff with it. But the list of people who are being kind of offered a position on the committee often has to kind of be made public so that the rest of the membership has the opportunity to kind of share any issues that they might have with it. The reality is, though, that you might get a vocal minority, but the large majority of membership are just happy that the club's continuing, that somebody stepped up into a role, and aren't awfully fussed on what things are going on, as long as things are running relatively smoothly for them on a day-to-day. So, if you're thinking about taking up a role as a committee member for a car club, what sort of things does it involve? Well, I guess the main thing is often regular meetings, and these have taken a bit of a shift in recent years. Previously, I think all meetings were in person, and sometimes you'd have to travel quite a distance, particularly if you're part of a national club. But more recently, a lot of clubs have adapted the fact that they were using Zoom over COVID into kind of perhaps alternate meetings on Zoom, or perhaps kind of occasional meetings on Zoom and other meetings in person. So there's been a kind of switch in that regard, which might make the role kind of a little bit more accessible, but I can't lie, there's sometimes a lot of driving involved, and that does kind of lend to the level of commitment. Some clubs are able to kind of support you with refunding any petrol and things like that is spent on getting to wherever you're going, but other times, if it's a really small club, they might not have the funds to be able to do that, and it's a case of you taking that as kind of part of your commitment to the club, I guess. I think one of the really key things that people don't realise is that it's not just about the everyday running of a club, it's also about being creative about the future of a club. So you are going to have to be thinking kind of between those meetings sometimes creatively about ideas that you think will improve the club. You might want to be thinking about papers and stuff that you can put forward for consideration at committees that will introduce changes, or in the very least come to meetings where other people's ideas are being discussed and be prepared to offer your thoughts, your creative responses to that, and kind of collaborate with them on those ideas, or offer alternatives to whatever solution, whatever problem it is that they've presented their initial solution to. When you become a committee member, it's also worth thinking about the fact that you're representing the club, and quite often that can lead to you kind of being associated with the club, and that can create kind of a fine line between your personal platforms and your role as an official. I'm always really careful in terms of the fact that everything that goes on the podcast is my own personal representations and understandings and things like that, and whilst you kind of might know that I'm on the committee for the MMOC, I'm also drawing from lots of other experience, and I try and make that apparent in my little chats and stuff like that. And personally, I found that it can be really tough to get involved with car clubs and to get involved with committees and discussions and offering advice and thoughts and things like that. And one of the big things that I've found you've got to have is resilience. Going to your first meeting of anything can be really tricky, and a club that is kind of so devoutly precious about the future of themselves can be sometimes a little bit wary of a newcomer that's coming in and suggesting things different, or thinking about things differently. And whilst that can be good for moving the club forward, they might also be wary that they don't know your intentions. And so first meetings can often be really scary for you, but also really scary for them in terms of your being a new person and them not knowing fully your intentions. And so having the resilience to go, okay, maybe that didn't go how I wanted, perhaps I'll go again and try again and look at things from a different way, or put things in an email, in writing beforehand, so that people have got time to think about it. All of these sorts of things, it's just being creative and sticking it out. Obviously, in the best case scenario, you go to a committee meeting and have a really good time, and you feel like it's gone really well and it's really productive. But it can be tricky. There's lots of people who are got varying opinions, varying experiences, and nobody's necessarily wrong, but you've then got to come to an agreeable decision about what the future is and what's going to work best, at least for now. Might not be for the long term the best option, but at least for now sometimes. And that can cause all sorts of difficulties, and a good committee meeting will result in discussion, and making sure that discussion is productive is often the tricky part. But being resilient to it and kind of keep showing up, keep trying, and maybe after 3 or 4 meetings, if it's still not working for you, then you've tried. But I think sometimes it can be really easy to go, oh, well, I thought I was going to come in with all these brilliant new ideas and it was going to be really well received, and I was going to immediately turn things around for this club, and that isn't always going to be the case, because you're always going to be outnumbered as the first new person. So that resilience is really important, and sticking it out especially important if you think that you can help them and make things better. So that's a little bit about kind of what being on a car club committee can look like, or involved with the car club committee, and also kind of what might be expected of a car club committee from its members. In terms of the future of car club committees, it's become quite a hot topic. It was something that was discussed on the NEC November stage by myself on some panels, and also I'm sure it's come up in lots of other places, because notoriously a lot of the older members are retiring, stepping down, and finding individuals to fill their spots on committees is becoming increasingly more difficult, particularly in the named positions, such as the secretary, treasurer, or chairperson. And this is often because those roles have become inflated over time. Somebody might have taken that role on quite young, and as they've retired, they've taken on more and more responsibilities and offered up things, and now they see that their role is quite big, but actually the bare bones of that role isn't always as big as it seems, and some of that responsibility might be able to be shared among other committee members and split that role down into what's actually manageable. Because I think it's worth noting that the volunteering that's involved in being on a committee is often harder to take on, especially for younger people these days. I've spoken before about the idea that people's free time is arguably more valuable to them now. We've got a real kind of hustle culture that's going on, and a need to kind of have second jobs, or a way of making extra money on the side of your everyday job, and giving up free time to something that's going to take up time, perhaps petrol money and things like that, is a real privilege, and it shouldn't be overlooked. But we've got to find a way that makes that time more affordable to these car clubs to be able to get those young people in and get them involved, because I don't like saying like, oh, they're the future of the club, or things like that, but there is an element of we need to build in some succession, get younger people involved sooner, and perhaps in those more generic committee roles, so that when older people step down, they can see kind of what parts they're able to help out with and take on. And it's not just younger people that aren't stepping up now. We're seeing that it's just difficult to get anybody to step into some of these roles. A lot of the membership are just assuming that somebody else is going to step in. You can look at the Morris Minor Owners Club as an example, where there's 8,000 members, and yes, we get people that sometimes come along and decide that it's not for them, but that's 2 or 3 people in a membership that is 8,000 people strong. If you think about even some of the smaller clubs that are trying to fill out a committee, often of the same amount of people, in order to be legitimate, and are drawing from a much smaller pool, it's getting harder, regardless of size. And that's not just because young people aren't necessarily stepping up or aren't able to fit that into their commitments. It's because a lot of people are more reluctant to get involved, or don't understand the complexities of it, or have overcomplexed it in their minds. They've made it more difficult, or they've seen somebody who's done the role for years and years and years, done an absolutely exceptional job of it, perhaps taken on lots of extra duties alongside their kind of main role, and it feels impossible to be able to fill their boots. So that can be a really tricky thing for car clubs to navigate, because people might find it difficult to feel comfortable stepping into that role as a result, even though they want to help. So getting them on sooner, getting them in the smaller, less difficult roles could really help address that, so that they can kind of get familiar with some of it before the need is there to fill them in the upper roles. If clubs aren't already using Zoom alternately and reducing the kind of time intensity of some of these things, then that could be another way to build in the accessibility of some of it, so that more people feel that they can at least try out getting involved in committees and helping out their car clubs. But I guess it is worth thinking about whether car clubs will always look like this, and whether they will always have this level of committee and I guess legitimacy in the way that they have had historically. They've been very much based on the clubs of the past and things like the RAC, but even like working men's clubs, because that's how hobbyist clubs have been run for years and years and years. But the reality is that the way that people are engaging with and enjoying the hobby is changing, and we're seeing more modern groups step up and run things differently, and not have that kind of structure, but still offer the kind of camaraderie and relationships with people. So for example, the Young Retro Motor Club isn't run in that kind of traditional structure necessarily, but still has successful events and successful representation and engagement. I run the WDSC, the Women Drivers Social Club, mostly by myself, with just kind of a bit of input from my sister and my family. But for the most part, I'm doing little bits and bobs like that, and because I'm not kind of charging a fee for membership, the kind of need for legitimacy in terms of representing the club and things like that is different. It's a different expectation, and people are engaging with clubs that are multi-mark and more broad like that more frequently now. So we might see things change, especially as some car clubs are finding that what made them unique and useful to ownership, so for example availability of spares, support with ownership, support with repairs, isn't necessarily unique to them now, because it can be accessed in other ways sometimes, especially with your bigger marks like Morris, like Minis, like Beetles even to an extent. There isn't necessarily a need to belong to a specific make club, and if you'd rather hang out with lots of people with lots of different cars, then we might see huge changes in that regard. But for the time being, car clubs that are mark based and some others are being run this way, And hopefully my little chat about what it involves and what it can look like is making it seem a little bit more achievable for some people, and maybe you can consider getting involved. You have the right to ask if you can come along to a committee meeting just to see what's going on, in a lot of cases, and that might be just enough to get you kind of interested and see if it's for you. There's no, you don't have to say, yes, I'm happy to commit to X amount of years right off the bat. Most car clubs are just thrilled that someone's showing an interest and will be happy to have you along to kind of observe and get involved to an extent, and then go from there. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about what you think the future of car clubs and committees and stuff like that might look like. If you've got any questions for me about kind of my level of commitment, for those of you who kind of aren't fully aware, I am the young members representative on the MMOC committee, but also for a short period of time being an interim secretary for the club side of things. After Ray stepped down at Christmas, New Year's, it means that I've now kind of taken up a small amount of that role in terms of day-to-day committee running and things like that. So that has been an interesting change of pace. So I'm able to kind of answer a couple of questions about those sorts of things, especially if you're interested in getting involved in that way. But thank you ever so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and in the meantime, drive safely and happy motoring.